hop right into it. And actually today we're going to discuss the lower trapezius. So this is a muscle that, in my opinion, is a little bit neglected or forgotten about or kind of put off to the wayside. And it's not a muscle that's very often talked about. So a lot of times you'll hear people talking about, oh, you have to, work on your mid-back strength and strengthen your mid-back for your overhead squats and strengthen your mid-back for your overhead presses and snatches. And that's a very general term. And typically what people are talking about when they're talking about the mid-back is really that lower trapezius muscle. So your lower trap is really truly like right in that mid-back area. So right underneath your shoulder blade, and it attaches down into your spine. So it's right there in the middle of your back. Its functions primarily are to help with upward rotation of your shoulder blade. So when you're reaching overhead, your shoulder blade is moving in an upward motion to help assist your arm being able to go up overhead. And so your lower trap helps with that and helps with stabilizing in that position. It also helps with, its main function is depression of the shoulder blade. So basically what that means is that like down and back position, right? So whenever you hear somebody say, oh, get your shoulder blade down and back, that's what your lower trap is doing, is pulling that shoulder blade down. You want to think about pulling it down kind of into your opposite back pocket of your jeans. So pulling it down. And it also kind of helps with a little bit of retraction, not a lot. So in terms of retraction, that means pulling your shoulder blade closer to your spine. So again, if we're thinking about that down and back position, pulling your shoulder blade down into your opposite back pocket, then that's kind of like that retraction with depression. So pulling that shoulder blade down into a really nice position. So those are the main functions of your lower trapezius muscle. This is important because it helps with, like I said, stabilizing you in an overhead position with your overhead squats, overhead presses, snatches, jerks, anything overhead. Is that lower trap is really going to help stabilize your back, your posture, your what's happening at your shoulder blade, and that's all a big domino effect, right? So if we can get that really nice position of our shoulder blade down and back, then we're locked in here and we have a lot more control going on. One of the practical implications for that, right, is when you're reaching up overhead, we don't want to be kind of like up here near our ear and just kind of hanging out wherever. We want to be in that nice locked position, nice and locked, right, with that shoulder blade down and back, taking that pressure off of the top of your shoulder. So if you're here and you're really reaching this way, there's a lot of pressure and a lot of pinching going on the top of that shoulder. So if we can get that down and clear this area, then it's going to be much more comfortable. You're not going to have any shoulder pain after your lift. During your lift, you have a lot less increased risk for injury, especially to the rotator cuff, which we talked about last week, right? With that rotator cuff up here, if we're just constantly in this position, then we're jamming that rotator cuff. If we bring it down, clear out that space, and we take the stress off at the top of that rotator cuff on the top of your shoulder there. So has a lot of really good practical implications. It has direct effects on the shoulder blade, and those direct effects on the shoulder blade help with indirect effects on the actual shoulder. Puts us in a really great position and helps us reduce the risk of injury. We're going to talk a lot about in the shoulder workshop the different movements of your arm and your shoulder and how the shoulder blade plays a role in that. It's a little bit confusing. I know when I first went to school, when I first went to PT school, learning about all the upward rotation and downward rotation and of your shoulder blade and protraction and retraction and how that all goes together with your shoulder movements is really daunting. And when a lot of people talk about it, it kind of goes over your head a little bit, especially if you're not really very aware of what the movements at the shoulder are. So in the shoulder workshop, we're really going to break that down and really try to explain to you guys exactly what's going on. to give you more of a visual of how these muscles play such an important role in your shoulder function and movement, and being able to move in a healthy and optimal way. We'll also in the shoulder workshop go over a lot of exercises for the lower trap. Anytime I have anybody with shoulder pain, obviously the first goal is to figure out ways to start to reduce that pain, but typically I would say 9 times out of 10, people with shoulder pain have a really weak lower trap. And I hammer exercises for the lower trap in all kinds of different ways. When we start lying on your belly and doing like Supermans and I's and Y's. I's, Y's, and Supermans are an exercise specifically. They're really great for the lower trap, but I typically see them done poorly. And so when I give people this exercise, they're like, oh, I do that all the time. And then I ask them to demonstrate, and they end up in like a reverse like seal position, and they're not really using that lower trap. And so during the shoulder workshop, we're really going to go over how to feel the lower trap, how you know you're working it, specific cues for the lower trap so you can really strengthen your mid-back section for all of your overhead lifting. And I also want to, heard a noise out the door. I also want to reiterate that, you know, overhead lifting doesn't have to necessarily mean that you're going to the gym and doing military presses with the barbell, or doing heavy overhead presses with a dumbbell, or snatches or clean and jerks. Overhead lifting can be if that's like what you typically do for your job, or if you have kids that you are lifting overhead, or if you do a lot of overhead lifting at home. It doesn't have to be that you're going to the gym all the time. Overhead lifting happens every day in our daily lives. Every